In our last video, What is a Theory?, we explored the nature of a theory, its definitions, components, and importance in our research and practice. Today we turn to what a theory is not. This video is about busting common myths and misconceptions that often mislead doctoral students and even seasoned researchers about theory. By the end of this video, you will not only be able to define what theory is, but also guard against false misconceptions of what theory is not. Let's first set the stage. In our last video, we established theory as a map, a lens, and a scaffolding, a practical tool that helps us explain and navigate complex realities. Yet many misconceptions about theory persist in academic circles. Those misconceptions can sabotage your understanding and the use of theory if left unexamined. Why do we need to talk about what theory is not? Because misconceptions lead to poor research. If someone believes a theory is just an ivory tower idea with no real-world truth, they may dismiss theory entirely. If another believes a theory is internally true, they may stop questioning and refining theories, which goes against the very essence of research. Misconceptions can also cause us to uncritically accept dominant theories without asking, whose agenda does this theory serve? Does this theory still hold in my context? As well-trained researchers, part of your intellectual growth is learning to spot flawed thinking about theory itself. Let's tackle 5 pervasive misconceptions one by one. For each misconception, we'll discuss why it is misleading, and I'll use examples to debunk it. Misconception number 1. Theory is objective truth. The myth is that a theory shows absolute objective truth. Once a theory is established, it is the truth. Many practitioners new to research may think theories are ironclad laws. After all, we hear phrases like evidence X, Y, and Z proved the theory, which suggests finality or factual truth. In reality, theories are provisional models of reality, not the reality itself. A scientific theory can never be proven true, only falsified. The best we can say is that a theory has not been refuted yet and fits the evidence we have so far. We err when we label a theory simply right or wrong. Theories are very rarely about finding the truth. Instead, theories are about developing the best model to fit observation. In other words, all theories are simplifications. Statistician George Box put it memorably, all models are wrong, but some are useful. A theory, like a map, represents the terrain of reality, but it's not the terrain itself. Just like a map may highlight certain roads and omit others, a theory highlights certain factors and relationships while simplifying others. A map is not the territory, and the theory is not objective reality, but a tool to understand reality. History is rife with so-called truths that turned out to be temporary. In science, the Ptolemaic theory once placed the Earth at the center of the universe. This was the truth for centuries. Copernicus' heliocentric theory upended, which showed how a well-established truth was in fact a model. And even the Copernican model was not perfect. It took Kepler and Newton to refine our solar system theory. In leadership, early trait theory claimed leaders are born with specific traits, which implied a fixed truth of what makes a leader. Later research showed context and learned behavior matter greatly, which shattered that notion of internal truth of leadership. What we consider objective truth in theory can be overruled with new perspectives and data, and we must remain humble and view theories as tentative. What a scientific community accepts as truth shifts with new paradigms. A theory's strength lies not in being truth, but in being useful and testable. The moment a theory is treated as unquestionable truth, it ceases to be scientific, we must always allow for inquiry. Where does a theory fall short? In what context might it not hold? This leads us to our next misconception. The myth is that theory is nothing but philosophical musing or opinion. It's not grounded in evidence, so practitioners can ignore it. You may hear from a leader or manager, I'm a practical person. Theory is too abstract or academic for me. There is an implication that theory is a philosophy, which is not useful in the real world. It is true that theory is closely connected to philosophy. Our theories are underpinned by our philosophical assumptions about knowledge and reality. But good theory in science is more than armchair philosophizing. It's grounded in systemic observation and logic. Theory is a statement of relations among concepts within a set of boundary assumptions. Theory is aimed at explaining how and why. In short, theory is where philosophy meets data. It is informed by empirical research and intended to be testable. A theory must be falsifiable to speak about reality. This injects a rigorous scientific principle into what could otherwise be pure speculation. Simply weaving philosophical arguments without linking observable phenomena does not constitute a theory. Theory requires logical structure and connection to evidence. Here is an example. For centuries, moral philosophers mainly asked how people ought to decide. The descriptive question of how they actually decide lay mostly dormant until the 20th century. Psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg advanced that descriptive agenda into a developmental theory of 6 progressively more sophisticated stages of moral reasoning, validated through structured moral dilemma interviews. Later, Jonathan Haidt built on David Hume's idea that reason is the servant of the passion and developed a social intuitionist model. The social intuitionist model critiqued Kohlberg's cognition-first view, arguing that moral judgment usually arises from rapid, affect-laden intuitions, with reasoning recruited ad hoc for justification or social persuasion. A parallel pattern appears in leadership studies. Servant leadership begins with a normative ethic of putting followers' growth first, later operationalized into measurable dimensions such as empathy, listening, stewardship, healing, community building, and commitment to others' growth. Authentic leadership translates existential and virtue ethic themes into 4 empirically tested constructs: self-awareness, relational transparency, balanced processing, and an internalized moral perspective. Well, both servant and authentic leadership theories acknowledge an intuitive moral impulse. Authentic leadership explicitly retains a deliberative component, balanced processing, which shows that intuition and reasoning can be complementary rather than sequential. In each case, philosophical insights become scientific theories only when scholars specify constructs, articulate mechanisms, and subject those mechanisms to systematic empirical scrutiny. Theory building is a creative process that combines philosophical insight with scientific rigor. A good theory stands on a tripod: conceptual imagination, logical coherence, and empirical support. In fact, many philosophies of science emphasize that theories are validated by their practical consequences. So rather than just philosophy, think of theory as a philosophy with accountability. It must ultimately answer to observation and usefulness. Far from being impractical, theory guides effective action. And as we saw in my last video, theory gives us a lens to see problems in new ways. Philosophy sets the stage, yes, but theory is the play itself, unfolding with data and experience. Misconception 3. Theory is final and perfect. The myth is that once a theory has been established with enough evidence, it becomes a permanent, flawless representation of reality. This myth treats a theory almost like laws of nature that, once discovered, don't change. For example, some may thought Newton's theory of gravity was the final word until Albert Einstein came along. In social sciences, you may hear people treat Maslow's hierarchy of needs or transformational leadership as they were timeless truths that require no further scrutiny. No theory is ever final. Theories are always works in progress. In fact, the hallmark of scientific progress is that theories are refined or replaced as new evidence and perspectives emerge. A strong theory not only specifies what, how, and why, but also under what conditions, the who, where, and when it applies. Those boundary conditions mean a theory's applicability is limited. Change the context or look closer. The theory may break down or need refinement. Moreover, theories often have hidden assumptions that may fail over time or under new scrutiny. A mature scholar recognizes that theories are not truths carved in stone, but dynamic explanations subjected to revision or even revolution. In the history of science, the shift from Newtonian physics to Einstein's relativity is a classic example. Newton's laws worked extremely well for centuries and still do in everyday conditions, but they were not perfect or final. Einstein showed that at high speeds and gravitational fields, a new theory was needed. Einstein's theory, in turn, is not the final word either. Quantum physics and the search for unified theory continue. In organizational science, consider scientific management from the early 20th century. It was a theory of efficiency that treated workers like cogs. It worked in many industrial settings and it became hugely influential, almost taken as a law of management. But it was far from perfect. It ignored human motivation and social factors. The rise of the human relations movement effectively supplanted Taylor's theory in many domains. Similarly, leadership theory has evolved. Decades ago, great man theories suggested leadership qualities are innate and unchanging. That theory gave way to behaviorist theories, leadership styles, then situational and contingency theories, which argued the best leadership depends on context, then transformational leadership, and so on. Each new theory didn't just add on, it often challenged the finality of previous models. Our understanding of leadership is continuously refined. No single theory has proven perfect or immune to critique. Even very popular theories like transformational leadership, while powerful, have faced critiques. For example, that they overlook dark sides and cultural differences. Viewing theory as static or finished is antithetical to scholarly thinking. We must approach each theory with a healthy skepticism and a mindset of refinement. As researchers, we build on prior theory, but also test its limits. A good theory invites attempts to falsify or extend it. That's how knowledge grows. Even highly successful theories should not become sacred cows. Science advances by creative destruction of ideas. In practice, this means as you conduct literature reviews, note where authors call for future research or point out anomalies. Those are signs that a theory is not final, and an opportunity for you to contribute. The only final theory is one we've stopped examining, and that is a fundamental mistake in scholarly judgment. Misconception number 4. If a theory is popular and widely cited, it must be true or useful. The myth is that theories that everyone uses or cites are automatically valid and the best after all. So many people cannot be wrong. This is a kind of appeal to popularity or tradition. You may assume that because a theory dominates your coursework readings or shows up in many journal articles, it has to be the correct approach. Transformational leadership must be the most effective leadership theory. Look at how often it's cited and taught. That underlying belief is that the academic marketplace picks winners based on merit alone. Popularity is not a reliable indicator of truth or empirical support. It often reflects social processes in science. There is a well-documented Matthew effect in academia, where the rich get richer. That is, once a theory or a scholar gains popularity, it tends to get disproportionate attention and citations irrespective of its merit. Citations in academic literature follows a power law distribution. A few articles or theory garner a large number of citations, while most languish with few. This power law distribution can be self-perpetuating. Scholars gravitate to what's already famous. As a result, a theory can become canonical not purely because of merit, but because of historical background or strong promotion by influential proponents. Sociologists of knowledge also point out that dominant paradigms often silence or overshadow alternative voices. There is a cumulative advantage at play. In blunt terms, more fame, which is not the same as evidence breeding truth. One striking example is the diffusion of the IQ genetics theory in the early 20th century. The idea that intelligence is predominantly hereditary was popular in certain circles and cited by many to justify eugenics policies. It gained attraction because it aligned with social ideologies of the time, not because the evidence was unsellable. Over time, as more diverse emerged, that theory's simplistic and biased nature was exposed, but not before doing harm in policy. In management, consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's everywhere, taught in countless management and leadership programs, cited by many papers. Yet, scholars have tested Maslow's theory empirically. The rigid 5-level hierarchy often fails to hold up. For example, Waber and Bridwell conducted a comprehensive review of the research from the 1950s to 1970s and concluded that there was little empirical support for the hierarchical ordering of needs. In 2011, Tay and Dina used data from over 60,000 individuals across over 100 articles and found that the 5 categories of needs, such as safety, belonging, and esteem, were generally relevant. They did not emerge in a fixed progression. Many individuals simultaneously pursue multiple types of needs depending on life circumstances. Similarly, Kendrick and the team updated the model using evolutionary theory. They proposed that self-actualization should be replaced by goals related to acquisition, retention, and parenting, and that needs function in a flexible, adaptive system rather than sequence. This example is a sobering realization that many ideas go viral in academia due to appeal, simplicity, or the prominence of the scholar rather than rigorous proof. We need to exercise critical thinking and look at the evidence for a theory independent of its popularity. As scholars, we should not be swayed just by citation counts or adoption in practice. This is where understanding the sociology of science helps. Being aware of phenomena like the Matthew effect or bandwagon effects prompts us to ask, is this theory objectively powerful, or is it riding on reputation? One telltale sign of a healthy theory is that it continues to be tested in new studies and across contexts, not just praised and assumed true. For example, transformational leadership is popular, but fortunately, it has also been scrutinized in hundreds of studies, if not thousands, which generally support many of its claims. For example, that inspiring vision correlates with follower performance, while also uncovering limitations, for example, potential for leader dependency or burnout. We must pay attention to those empirical details, not just the shining halo of popularity. Remember, in science, ideas are not necessarily true by majority vote. Even a broad consensus can be overturned by a single rigorous study that exposes a flaw in the prevailing view. Keep an independent mindset. Popular or not, what does the evidence actually show? When people say, follow the science, what we should really be advocating is follow the evidence. Science is a method, not a monolith, and its credibility rests on its willingness to revise, not reinforce comfortable beliefs. Who benefits from this theory being dominant? This is a powerful question to ask of any popular theory. Does the theory reinforce the status quo or certain power structures? For example, a theory that great leaders are born, not made, obviously benefits those who are already in power or who fit the historically favored profile of leader, and it discourages leadership development for others. By asking who gains from a dominance, we become aware that theories exist in a social context. Dominant groups or paradigms often promote theories that align with their worldviews. This does not automatically invalidate a theory, but it should spark your curiosity. Are there alternative theories that are being overlooked? Whose voice or experiences might this popular theory ignore? We'll revisit this when examining leadership theories later. The key takeaway for now is that don't confuse widespread acceptance with proof of validity. Keep your analytical lens sharp, even for superstar theories. Misconception number 5, a philosophical worldview is a sufficient theoretical framework. The myth is that declaring an overarching philosophy is the same as having a theory. A student may say, my theoretical framework is constructivism, or I'm using critical theory as my framework, and believe that this alone provides a guiding theory for their study. The confusion here is between epistemological or philosophical stances and specific theories. Constructivism, positivism, interpretivism, and others are worldviews or paradigms about how knowledge is generated or what reality is like. The myth is thinking about adopting one of those views checks the box of a theoretical framework without the need for a more concrete model or theory relevant to the actual phenomenon being studied. A worldview or paradigm is not a substitute for a specific theory. Donald Willower critiqued much of the educational administration literature as being theoretically oriented rather than truly theoretical. What he meant is that scholars often operate under broad orientations without developing actual theory, that is, testable propositions and defined constructs for their specific problem. Constructivism, for example, is a meta-theory or philosophy of knowledge. It posits that knowledge is constructed by learners or observers. That is a great starting principle, but on its own, it does not tell you which concepts or construct to study or how they relate in a given context. In other words, constructivism can guide you to value subjective meanings, but you still need a more specific theory, say a theory of how organizational culture is constructed, to serve as your theoretical framework. If the study is about how teachers adopt technology, a constructivist epistemology may lead one to choose diffusion of innovation theory or technology acceptance model as the theoretical framework. Those are specific theories that align with or can be used in a constructivist or interpretivist paradigm, but provide what, how, and why of the phenomenon. Philosophical worldviews guide the kinds of theories we build, but they're not themselves detailed theories of specific phenomena. Think of your worldview as the foundation of a house and your specific theory as the architectural blueprint. You need both to build a solid structure. If you only have a foundation, which is a philosophy, with no blueprint, which is a theory, you won't know where to place the walls, the doors, and the windows of your study. On the other hand, if you only have a theory with no awareness of your philosophical footing, you may not realize the assumptions you are building on. The remedy is always pair your general philosophical worldviews with a substantive theory that suits your specific research questions. If you align with constructivism and you are studying organizational change, you may adopt sense-making theory as your specific framework for how people construct meaning during organizational change. Before moving on, it's worth noting how several of those misconceptions interplay. The idea that popularity is truth, which is misconception number 4, and worldviews can stand in for theories, which is misconception number 5, can both point to a deeper issue, the social construction of knowledge. In reality, theory building is done by communities of scholars with particular worldviews, values, and interests. Theory is not born in a vacuum, it's socially embedded. This means we must stay aware of whose voices dominate theory and how contextual dominance may bias what is accepted as valid theory. We have touched on this by asking who benefits from a theory's dominance. Next, we'll make this concrete by critiquing some dominant theory in leadership and organizational science. Even widely respected theories have blind spots or were shaped by their times. This will further reinforce what theory is not. It's not above critique, not one-size-fits-all, not free of context. In applied fields like leadership and management, certain theories rise to prominence and can almost achieve holy grail status in textbooks. As researchers, one of your tasks is to critically examine the strengths and limitations of those celebrated theories. Here, I build on our misconceptions, especially the ideas that theory is not objective truth and that popularity does not guarantee validity of the theory. We'll look at a couple of dominant leadership and organizational theories and analyze what they're not accounting for. Hopefully, this will provoke you to think of how they might be improved or challenged in your research. Early leadership research in the 1940s and 1950s was dominated by trait theories. Leaders are born with certain traits. They were dominant paradigms. Organizations eagerly adopted personality tests for selecting born leaders, and training programs taught the one best way to lead. However, over time, scholars realized those theories were not the whole theory. They failed to account for situational context. Trait theory could not reliably predict who would succeed as a leader across different situations. A person effective in one context flopped in another. This paved the way for contingency theory. For example, the Fiedler's contingency model and Howe's path-goal theory. Those contingency theories argue that effectiveness depends on fit between leadership style and the situation. What trait and style theories were not is flexible or contextual. They presented themselves as universally true, which we found to be a myth. Jumping from one of the most dominant modern leadership theories, transformational leadership, it's difficult to overestimate its influence. It's revolutionized how we think about leadership by focusing on inspiring and developing followers. But even this well-established theory is not above critique. For one, early formulations of transformational leadership painted in very heroic positive terms, essentially assuming leaders with vision and charisma are universal good. In practice, later research found Charismatic transformational leaders can sometimes lapse into authoritarianism or encourage excessive follower dependence. Also, transformational leadership theory was born in a Western cultural context, which emphasizes individual inspiration and linear change. Some scholars argue it does not fully fit cultures that value collective decision-making or humility in leaders. In other words, transformational leadership is not a one-size-fits-all formula, even though its popularity may suggest it is. It does not guarantee positive outcomes in every scenario. Think of leaders who inspired great change but towards unethical ends. Toxic leaders can also be charismatic. The transformational leadership theory has evolved by adding concepts like pseudo-transformational leadership, leaders who are charismatic but self-interested or unethical. This evolution is a healthy reminder that a theory's widespread adoption does not mean it's flawless or complete. Continuous critique and refinement are always necessary. Now, let's narrow our focus further to a subfield of leadership administration and organizational science. This subfield is educational leadership and administration. This is an applied field where theory and practice constantly interact. Are the prevailing theories in educational leadership truly theories, or are they just buzzwords or vague models? What misconceptions about theory may be especially common in this field? Educational leadership, or school leadership or educational administration, is a domain where many of you work and will conduct research. It is a field that borrowed heavily from general leadership and management theory, but also developed its own frameworks. Here, we examine how the misconceptions of theory manifest in this subfield, and I'll critique a few prevailing theories. Our goal is to identify what counts as a theory in educational leadership and what pitfalls to avoid as scholars. Some frameworks commonly seen in educational leadership are instructional leadership, transformational leadership, distributed leadership, servant leadership, and social justice leadership. In the 1980s, the theory of instructional leadership became highly influential. It certainly was valuable. It shifted focus to teaching and learning as the core of school leadership. However, for a while, instructional leadership was more of a prescription or model than a fleshed-out theory. It enumerated behaviors of effective principles, like visiting classrooms, discussing curriculum, and using test data, but did not initially explain why those actions lead to better outcomes or under what conditions. Researchers later built more theory around it, for example, incorporated into frameworks of learning-centered leadership that have testable propositions. If principals give teacher meaningful feedback, which is action X, then teacher instruction improves, which is outcome Y, because of Z reasoning. Early on, practitioners latched onto the phrase of being an instructional leader without a clear theory behind it. This reflects conception number 5, adopting a popular idea without an underlying explanatory theory. The lesson is that as scholars, we should push further. If a framework is popular, what is the theoretical mechanism here? Is there evidence for each link in the chain? If not, there is room to build or refine theory. Distributed leadership is a theory that gained popularity from the late 1990s onward. It suggests leadership in schools and organizations is not just about the single person at the top, but spread among teachers, staff, and teams. This resonates strongly with practitioners because it mirrors collaborative culture ideals. But as several scholars have pointed out, distributed leadership often lacks a clear definition and causal explanation. It can mean so many things in practice that it verges on being a buzzword. One leader may say, I practice distributed leadership by having teacher leaders on committees, which is an organizational structural arrangement. Another might mean I encourage initiative at all levels, which is an organizational cultural aspect. The theory behind how distributed leadership leads to better results is not always clearly specified. Is it because it increases buy-in? Because it allows access to more expertise? Because it relieves overburden principles? All of those are plausible, but they need to be theorized and tested. Without that, distributed leadership can be too mushy. It's something to be refined into a tighter theory. And this illustrates that a theory can be socially popular as it aligns with the values of collaboration. However, the theory is not fully developed as a theory. A scholar can work to turn the theory into a model with refined variables, for example, level of teacher leadership, and decision-making breadth, and hypothesis, for example, schools with a higher teacher leadership, distributed leadership, have higher student achievement mediated by teacher self-efficacy and collective responsibility. This would elevate it from a loose idea to a testable theory. Unfortunately, the field of leadership and the subfield of educational leadership are prone to fetish ideas that are not theoretically sound. We saw this with administrative fads like merit pay solves everything. Part of scholarly training is to differentiate between a fact and a theory. The fad may be popular, widely implemented, and even politically supported. But our job as researchers is to ask, does the evidence support it? So again, the most popular solution is not always the one grounded in sound theory. We have to subject theory to empirical scrutiny to avoid swaying from untheorized fad to the next. We must ensure that what we call theory truly has explanatory power and is open to examination. If you find yourself describing a leadership approach in purely descriptive terms, for example, the leaders invite team members in decisions, push further. Why does that matter? That why is your theoretical element. Perhaps it's because involving team members increases a sense of ownership, which is based on the theory of self-determination theory, or because it distributes expertise, which is based on social capital theory. By tying practice to theory, you avoid superficial analysis and you build knowledge that accumulates. To connect back to the topic of this video, many things in leadership sound like a theory, but are not. They may be philosophies, models, values, or practices. Part of our research journey is to learn to tell the difference. Theory is not a buzzword or a slogan. It should be a well-reasoned explanation. If it is missing, your research may end up being just a collection of data without insight. If it is misapplied, like using irrelevant or flimsy theory just because it's trendy, your conclusion may miss the mark. Understanding what theory is not in this field specifically can guard you against those pitfalls. Now, how can you apply what we've covered, what theory is not, to your own research journey and professional expertise? Identify one theory or framework that is widely accepted in your field or organization. It could be a leadership approach, a management strategy, anything treated as conventional wisdom. Now, critically interrogate it. What underlying assumptions does it make? Are they always valid? What and who might this theory be leaving out or misrepresenting? Consider the context. Would it hold in a different culture or for a different group? What evidence supports it, and is there evidence that challenges it? Look for those studies that reported mixed findings or contradictory findings. This is something that I'm looking for in your literature review and theoretical framework. If you cite only one-sided evidence to support whatever claim you make, I don't think you're being critical enough. If you use instructional leadership as your theoretical framework in your study and you only cite the evidence that supports instructional leadership, you need to be critical in your literature review and theoretical framework. After all, we don't want one more study that confirms instructional leadership is effective. And finally, how can you refine or supplement this theory to address its gaps? Is there another theory that can be combined with it or a modification you will propose? Write down your thoughts. This exercise is about critical thinking. As scholars, you contribute knowledge not by reverently citing the status quo, but by probing it. Sometimes you will affirm that a theory really is strong. Other times, you will spot areas for contribution. In your journey of building theoretical frameworks, maintain a critical yet constructive mindset. Critique theories, but also have the courage to build better ones. Question dominant frameworks, but also strive to offer alternatives or improvements. This dual duty to question and to create is at the heart of scholarship and research. I encourage you as you move forward to apply the lessons we've learned here. When reading literature, identify authors' implicit misconceptions or unexamined assumptions about the theory. In your own academic writing, be explicit about your theoretical choices and why alternatives were set aside. In your leadership practice, become the leader who not only implements best practices, but also asks, what theory are we assuming here? And is it the best lens for our goals? Remember, theory is a servant of inquiry, not a master. It must earn its keep by illuminating our understanding. The moment a theory is treated as unquestionable or purely symbolic, it has lost its value. So keep thinking boldly and critically.